Imagine being summoned on a silent dawn in 1834 to perform a task that no royal physician has ever dared to undertake. The king is dead, but his presence still lingers like a spectre inside the palace in Madrid. Before you lies the body of Ferdinand VII, the monarch who marked Spain with 2 decades of tyranny, paranoia, and degradation. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, with tears in her eyes, begs for something so disturbing that her hands tremble before even touching the royal bed. There, between the silk sheets, it is not the lifeless face of the king that catches your attention, but what had been the source of secrets, embarrassment, and humiliation throughout his reign, his anatomical deformity. More than a physical trait, it was the mark of a destiny corrupted from the cradle, a cursed inheritance that mixed intimate shame and a distorted power over everyone around him. Fernando was not born cursed by spells or divine punishment. His tragedy was genetic. Centuries of intermarriage between the Habsburgs and Bourbons had turned the royal lineage into a melting pot of mental instability, disease, and deformities. The future king, born in El Escorial in 1784, was no exception, but rather the culmination of a poisoned inheritance. From childhood, the prince had been the target of whispers and veiled mockery. Court doctors recorded in secret documents, kept under lock and key, that the young heir had an anomaly so grotesque that it defied the understanding of science at the time. It was as if his body had been transformed into a cruel parody of virility. This condition not only isolated him, but also deeply shaped his mind. Beyond the political weight of wearing the crown, Fernando grew up tormented by the certainty that ridicule was inseparable from his existence. What could have been just a medical curiosity became an open wound, cultivating paranoia, resentment, and the conviction that everyone around him was laughing at him, even when they pretended to respect him. The environment in which he grew up only intensified this wound. His father, Charles IV, was a weak king more interested in hunting than in governing. His mother, Maria Luisa, indulged openly in favoritism and romance with Manuel Godoy, the strong man of the court. The young prince witnessed his father's weakness and his mother's audacity on a daily basis, learning early on that power was synonymous with betrayal and humiliation. But nothing corroded him as much as his own deformity. Servants whispered, foreign diplomats took outrageous stories out of Spain, and even tutors exchanged glances when he entered the room. It was impossible to escape the certainty that he was, above all, a grotesque spectacle. This psychological burden quickly translated into behavior. As a teenager, Fernando became vengeful and cruel. A single indiscretion, a sidelong glance, was enough for servants to be punished with exile or physical punishment. His power, still limited, was used as a weapon to mask his impotence in the face of his own shame. One episode marked this escalation. When a page accidentally surprised him without his clothes on, Fernando not only expelled him from court, he had him whipped and banished his entire family from Madrid. It was as if any witness to his secret had to pay the ultimate price. His every gesture revealed a man who was beginning to harden inside, a prince who turned intimate pain into cruelty. And so was born the monarch who would later be known as one of the most wicked in history. Comment below. Fernando's secret was his own prison. When he reached marriageable age, the court doctors already knew that his anomaly would be an insurmountable obstacle to a normal married life. Secret reports described in detail the disproportion and curvatures that made any intimate relationship impossible without special devices. Pillows, wooden devices, and supports were constructed in secret, as if the prince's marriage were more of a medical experiment than a royal union. Fernando, however, believed that marriage would bring him the normality he so desired. In 1802, he married his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. Young and romantic, she harbored illusions that she was marrying the desired one, a title that her supporters spread as political propaganda. The wedding, celebrated with splendor, seemed to promise a stable future. But the wedding night was a nightmare. Upon seeing her husband's body for the first time, Maria Antonia fell into despair. Servants reported that she screamed as if she had seen a monstrous creature. The shock was not only due to his size, but also to the bizarre shapes and deformities that transformed the intimate act into something terrifying. What should have been a moment of celebration turned into a scene of pain and embarrassment. Doctors had to intervene, as if performing surgery. Oils, pillows, and even doses of laudanum were used to help the Queen endure the trauma. With each failed attempt to consummate the marriage, the young woman's fear intensified. The failure to produce heirs became an open wound. Months turned into years, and the pressure on the couple only increased. For Fernando, each loss and each failure was a blow to his already shattered virility. For Maria Antonia, it was the repetition of a torment from which there was no escape. The obsession with having children led Fernando to seek increasingly bizarre solutions. Astrology, alchemy, exotic potions brought from distant lands, nothing seemed too ridiculous when it came to overcoming his limitation. The palace became a stage for unusual rituals, where charlatans promised miracles in exchange for gold. Maria Antonia, weakened, found refuge in an addiction to laudanum. What began as a way to endure the horror of marital nights turned into a growing dependence. Each attempt at pregnancy became physical and psychological torture. When she finally managed to conceive, her hopes were crushed by two devastating miscarriages. The first, in 1804, ended in the 4th month, the result of physical trauma that the Queen's body could not sustain. The second, in 1805, was even more cruel. She carried the pregnancy to term, only to see the baby die during a bloody delivery that almost took her life as well. From then on, Maria Antonia became a shadow of her former self. Instead of compassion, Fernando responded with accusations. Convinced that his wife was sabotaging her pregnancies, he began to accuse her of using herbs, poisons, or even political conspiracies to prevent the birth of an heir. The paranoid delusions that had haunted him since his youth now took over his marriage. Maria Antonia died in 1807 at the age of 21. Officially, she died of fever. In reality, she was the victim of abuse, chemical dependency, and despair. Rumors still circulated that Fernando may have poisoned his wife, tired of her uselessness. Thus ended the first of his marriages, leaving a trail of pain and suspicion in the heart of the Spanish court. Maria Antonia's death did not bring sincere mourning to Fernando. In public, he wore a mask of grief, but behind the scenes, he was already negotiating a new marriage. For him, his deceased wife was just a defective piece discarded in search of another who could fulfill the function of producing an heir. It was during this period that the prince's cruelty consolidated into sadism. Servants began to disappear for trivial reasons. Guards were sent to distant posts after minor mistakes. Fear spread through the corridors of the palace. No one knew what gesture could be interpreted as an offense to this man consumed by humiliation. Paranoia reached its peak in 1807, when Fernando became involved in a conspiracy against his own father. Supported by nobles and military officers, he plotted to overthrow Carlos IV and remove Godoy. But when he was discovered, instead of taking responsibility, he turned in the conspirators, betraying each one in exchange for forgiveness. It was a portrait of his essence, to use and discard without remorse. Meanwhile, his physical condition worsened. Doctors recorded that his body continued to develop even stranger deformities. Some suspected extremely rare hormonal disorders. With each passing year, the chances of a normal married life became more unlikely, increasing his frustration and instability. Fate seemed to be mocking him. The man who most wanted to perpetuate his name was unable to guarantee his own lineage. And the more he failed, the more cruel and distrustful he became of everyone around him. In 1808, fate struck again. Napoleon invaded Spain and forced Fernando to abdicate. Humiliated, he was taken prisoner to France. To the Spanish, he was a symbol of resistance against foreign rule. But behind the scenes, Fernando was nothing more than a defeated monarch, a prisoner not only of the French but also of his deformed body. During his years in captivity, French doctors examined him with scientific coldness. Detailed reports described what looked more like a mythological aberration than a human organ. For those experts, Ferdinand was a case study. For the king himself, it was yet another condemnation, a constant reminder that his private life was a laughingstock even in enemy territory. While Spanish soldiers died fighting for his restoration, Fernando spent his days writing letters in search of princesses who would accept his burden. The exile's priority was not his homeland, but finding a wife who could bear his reality. For him, the throne would only have meaning if it came with a legitimate heir. When he finally returned to Madrid in 1814, he was welcomed as a savior. People cried, threw flowers and knelt before his carriage. But Fernando's heart was not with the people who idolized him. He was obsessed once again with the bridal chamber. His return marked the beginning of a period known as the ominous decade, not only because of political tyranny, but also because of his desperate insistence on fulfilling his role as husband and king. With each failure, his frustration contaminated his political decisions. Governing was secondary. The priority was to defeat the invisible enemy he carried within himself. Fernando's second marriage took place in 1816 to Maria Isabel of Portugal. Young, only 19 years old, she arrived at court full of hope and naivety. The ceremony was grand, but it hid the shadow of a future already doomed. Nothing could prepare her for what she would face in private. On their wedding night, screams echoed through the corridors. Servants found blood, broken furniture, and a young queen in shock. From that day on, Maria Isabel was never the same. She developed tremors, began to avoid her husband's gaze, and lived under constant panic attacks. The trauma consumed her daily. Fernando, unable to comprehend the horror he had caused, saw his wife's revulsion as an insult. Fueled by paranoia, he began to believe that Maria Isabel was conspiring against him, that she wanted to humiliate him in front of foreign powers. From then on, the Queen's letters were spied on, her food was tested, and even her quarters were searched for evidence of treason. The couple's bedroom was transformed into a macabre laboratory. Foreign doctors, anatomists, and even charlatans were called in to observe their intimate encounters as if they were clinical experiments. The Queen's pain became a scientific spectacle. As the months passed, Maria Isabel suffered a psychological breakdown. Thin, fragile, almost a ghost, she succumbed in 1818. Officially, it was nervous exhaustion, but everyone knew she was the direct victim of a marriage that was more punishment than union. Maria Isabel's death did not stop Fernando. In 1819, he married again, this time to Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony. More mature and educated, she treated the marriage clinically, as a medical challenge to be managed. She brought with her doctors, notes and special preparations. The encounters were scheduled and reported in medical journals. The Queen described each attempt as if it were an experiment. This attitude, far from relieving the king, increased his insecurity. He no longer saw a wife, but a researcher who analyzed him as an object of study. For 10 years, they lived in a cold marriage, filled with failed attempts at conception. Until, in 1829, Maria Josefa became pregnant. It was a miracle for the court, and for Europe, which watched in amazement as the impossible king had finally produced an heir. But hope soon turned to tragedy. In the 7th month of pregnancy, complications ruined everything. The birth was a torment. A daughter was born prematurely and died within hours. The queen, weakened, did not survive for long. 3 weeks later, she also passed away. The palace was plunged into silence, but the king lost himself even further in madness. He ordered doctors to try to revive the dead mother and daughter, keeping their bodies on display for days amid the smell of decomposition. It was the final portrait of a broken man, unable to accept the failure that had accompanied him since birth. After Maria Josefa's death, Fernando no longer hid his emotional decline. Surrounded by doctors, alchemists, and spies, his private life had become a matter of state. Even so, in 1829, he agreed to marry again, this time to Maria Cristina of Naples. The marriage, however, carried a secret. His new wife was already pregnant and not with his child. Fernando, desperate for an heir, pretended to believe that the child was his. In 1830, Isabel II was born, the girl who would inherit the crown and who, ironically, symbolized the supreme contradiction of the king. The monarch, obsessed with producing offspring, handed over the throne to a daughter who did not carry his blood. The last years of his life were consumed by paranoia, nighttime inspections, spying on his wife, guards who monitored Maria Cristina's every move. The palace became a guarded prison where even the walls seemed to have eyes. His obsession went so far that Fernando had secret passages and holes in the walls installed to spy on the queen. He lived like a mad jailer, tormented by the idea of betrayals and conspiracies that existed only in his mind. The foreign court watched everything with astonishment. Diplomatic reports described a decadent, paranoid king incapable of governing. Spain, already in political and economic ruins, saw its fate tied to the intimate degradation of a man enslaved by his own body and his own madness. In 1833, the king's health finally collapsed. He suffered from tremors, insomnia, and bouts of delirium. He mixed political orders with musings about imaginary plots. He spent hours murmuring to portraits of his dead wives as if seeking explanation or forgiveness from them. Death came almost without ceremony, the result of years of physical and mental exhaustion. Officials recorded gout as the official cause, but doctors knew the truth. Fernando had died of complete physical and psychological exhaustion. His life had been a constant battle against a body that ridiculed him and a mind that tortured him. The autopsy revealed what was already known in the corridors of the court, an extreme deformity that made any kind of intimate normality impossible. Even more disturbing was the discovery of internal scars from attempts at self-mutilation, signs that the king had tried throughout his life to alter his own body in secret and failed miserably. His remains, preserved and hidden in secret archives, became a grotesque symbol of a greater tragedy, that of a kingdom dragged into the abyss by one man's obsession. What began as an intimate curse spread like a disease throughout an entire empire. Fernando VII did not go down in history as a just ruler or reformer. He was branded as the most perverted king in history, remembered not for his achievements, but for the suffering he inflicted on his wives, his subjects, and Spain itself. If this story made an impact on you, like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next videos.